SpongeBob has run for over 2 decades without ever being called controversial. Parents trust it. Nobody checks the schedule before letting it play. But episodes have vanished. One scene was cut after a national tragedy, and one original recording has remained unheard since 1997. In this video, we break down all the SpongeBob episodes you were never meant to see. SpongeBoy Ahoy! Steven Hillenburg drew the character into an educational pamphlet before anyone at a television network knew his name. He was a marine biology teacher at the Ocean Institute in Dana Point, California, working on a handmade booklet called The Intertidal Zone, designed to explain ocean life to visiting children. The character sketched into its pages was a talking sea sponge named Bob, and the show Hillenburg eventually built around that character went into full production in 1997 with a complete cast recording already finished before anyone discovered that the name on the tape belonged to a mop. Hillenburg had studied marine biology at Humboldt State University before pursuing a Master of Fine Arts in experimental animation at Cal Arts, an unusual combination of disciplines that gave him a working scientific knowledge of the ocean's smallest inhabitants and the visual training to draw them for an audience. During his time at the Ocean Institute in the late 1980s, he created an educational comic he called The Intertidal Zone, a handmade booklet designed to teach children about the various sea creatures living in shallow coastal water. That booklet contained a character named Bob the Sponge, a talking sea sponge who lived among the tidal pools alongside a collection of colorful animal companions. Bob was never intended to be anything more than a teaching tool, a friendly face on a pamphlet that kids could flip through while standing next to a touch tank. The idea that this same character would eventually sell billions of dollars in merchandise and run on screens around the world for multiple decades was not even a distant thought at the time it was drawn. Hillenburg left the Ocean Institute to pursue his animation degree at Cal Arts in the early 1990s, and not long after graduating, he was hired as a director on a Nickelodeon animated series called Rocko's Modern Life, an absurdist comedy built around an Australian wallaby navigating the chaos of suburban American life. Rocko's Modern Life ran from 1993 through 1996, and its production staff became one of the more unusually talented groups working in television animation during that period. A collection of writers, directors, and artists who pushed the show consistently further into strange, layered storytelling than most children's programming was willing to go at the time. Hillenburg thrived in that environment, and he started quietly developing ideas for a show of his own while still working there. After Rocko's Modern Life ended, Hillenburg threw himself into creating the pitch for what would become SpongeBob SquarePants. He built a detailed pitch Bible, a formal document presenting the show's concept, setting, characters, and tone to potential buyers. And the character at the center of it was not yet called SpongeBob at all. The character's name, as it appeared in that pitch Bible and in all of the earliest planning materials for the show, was SpongeBoy. The series itself was going to be called SpongeBoy Ahoy! The character's design was already recognizable in this earliest form, a square, porous, wide-eyed sea sponge with buck teeth and a good-natured expression, wearing a white shirt and brown pants, already anchored to a pineapple house and a community of undersea neighbors. The cheerfulness that would eventually define the character was already present in those early drawings. The name was simply different. Hillenburg pitched the show to Nickelodeon in 1997. The pitch went well enough that the network moved forward with the development of a pilot episode, and a full production began. The first episode was written, entitled Help Wanted, the story of SpongeBob applying for a job at a fast food restaurant called the Krusty Krab, owned by a money-obsessed crab named Mr. Krabs. The episode was completed in 1997, and voice recording sessions were held with the full cast. Tom Kenny, the voice actor who had worked alongside Hillenburg on Rocko's Modern Life, and whom Hillenburg trusted with the lead role, stepped into a recording booth and delivered every line of dialogue for the main character under that original name. The cast recorded the entire pilot, calling the character SpongeBoy. The recording was finished, the storyboards were complete, the character design was locked, and then the Nickelodeon legal team ran its standard trademark search on the name SpongeBoy and found something that stopped everything cold. The name SpongeBoy was already trademarked. A cleaning products company had registered it for use on a mop product, a mundane commercial use of the name that had nothing to do with cartoons or children's entertainment, but that nonetheless placed an insurmountable legal obstacle directly in the path of using it for a television character. The network could not proceed with a show called SpongeBob Ahoy when another company had already claimed that exact name as their own. Hillenburg responded to this discovery the way he responded to most creative problems, by solving it and moving forward. He decided to keep the word sponge in the character's name, reasoning that it was important for viewers to immediately know they were looking at a sea sponge rather than a block of cheese, which he apparently believed was a genuine risk of confusion given the square shape of the character's design. He chose the surname SquarePants because, by his own account, it simply had a nice ring to it. The character's first name became Bob, bridging the new identity back to the Bob the Sponge character from the original Ocean Institute pamphlet, where all of this had started. Every piece of voice recording that had been completed for the pilot had to be done again from the beginning. Every line Tom Kenny had recorded calling the character SpongeBob was now unusable. The entire audio track was re-recorded with the new name in place of the old one, a time-consuming and expensive correction to a problem that had been discovered only after the original work was already finished. The completed show moved forward under the name SpongeBob SquarePants, and by the time it reached Nickelodeon's development pipeline for broadcast, the original name had been left behind entirely. The pilot episode, as it was originally recorded under the SpongeBob Ahoy title, has never been made publicly available. In the years since the show became a cultural phenomenon, the existence of that original recording has been acknowledged in various behind-the-scenes accounts of the show's creation, but the actual footage and audio from that version has not surfaced through any official release. A brief, partial glimpse of the SpongeBob design appeared in a video produced for Nickelodeon's 25th anniversary in 2016, showing a close-up of the character's name tag in what appeared to be a still from production materials, the name SpongeBob clearly visible in the frame. That single shot has been studied closely by fans who document the show's production history, and it stands as one of the few confirmed visual records showing the character in his pre-rename form from any official source. The full pilot, as recorded under the SpongeBob Ahoy title, with Tom Kenny's voice saying that name across a complete episode, remains unreleased. In 2015, a version of the pilot was found by a fan and uploaded online, generating significant attention among the show's dedicated archivists and historians. That version turned out to be the post-renamed SpongeBob edition rather than the SpongeBob recording, essentially a copy of the episode as it aired on television, with minor differences in the opening sequence and the closing credits. Differences consistent with a production copy made before its broadcast, rather than anything that revealed the original name. The SpongeBob version was not it, and has not been found since. The completed Help Wanted episode, recorded under the SpongeBob name, finally aired on Nickelodeon on May 1st, 1999, paired with 2 short companion segments and broadcast immediately following the network's annual Kids' Choice Awards ceremony, a placement that ensured an unusually large audience for a series premiere. The episode drew approximately 6.9 million viewers that night, a number that gave the network immediate confidence in what it had, and SpongeBob SquarePants began building the audience that would eventually make it one of the most consistently watched programs on American cable television. The episode itself opens on an ordinary morning in the undersea community of Bikini Bottom, where SpongeBob wakes up full of determination and sets off for the Krusty Krab to apply for a job as a fry cook. The entire episode's humor turns on the gap between SpongeBob's overwhelming enthusiasm and the deep skepticism of the people around him. Mr. Krabs, deciding to get rid of the applicant without a direct confrontation, sends SpongeBob on what he assumes is an impossible errand, asking him to retrieve a hydrodynamic spatula with porthole starter attachments and a turbo drive. SpongeBob accepts the mission without questioning it and disappears, leaving Krabs and his existing employee Squidward to wait, assuming that will be the end of the matter. SpongeBob returns with the spatula. The episode ends with him producing a massive quantity of Krabby Patties to feed a pier full of hungry anchovies who had been threatening the restaurant, a sequence played entirely in a rapid, almost wordless rush that established establishes in a single scene what SpongeBob's cooking can do when he is allowed to work. The format of the show, the characters, the tone, the relationship between SpongeBob's blind optimism and the world's persistent tendency to underestimate him was all present and fully formed in those 8 minutes. What viewers in 1999 had no way of knowing was that this episode, the one that had just introduced them to every major character and established every central relationship of the show, could not be legally sold to them on a disc. When Nickelodeon assembled the complete first season DVD in 2003, 4 years after Help Wanted had launched the franchise, the episode was not included. The disc contained every other episode from the show's first year, but not its first one, creating a genuinely strange gap in what was supposed to be a definitive collection. Customers who bought the set expecting to own everything from the beginning discovered that the beginning itself was missing. The reason for this gap was a song. Help Wanted features a musical sequence built around a track called Livin' in the Sunlight, Lovin' in the Moonlight, a recording performed by the entertainer known professionally as Tiny Tim. Tiny Tim, born Herbert Cowrie in New York City in 1932, had built a career as a novelty act in the late 1960s by performing in an extremely high falsetto voice while playing a small ukulele, a combination that made him a genuinely unusual figure in American popular music during that era. His most famous appearance came on The Tonight Show in December of 1969, during which he married his girlfriend on air in front of an audience of tens of millions, a moment that briefly gave him enormous mainstream visibility. By the time Hillenburg was developing Help Wanted, Tiny Tim had long since passed out of mainstream cultural awareness, but his recordings retained a quality of cheerful, slightly unhinged eccentricity that fit perfectly with the show's developing tone. The track was used to score a sequence midway through the episode in which SpongeBob floods the area around the Krusty Krab with perfectly made Krabby Patties, a moment of effortless competence played against the absurdist chaos of an entire dock full of anchovies behaving like a rampaging mob. The music's bouncy, slightly odd energy matched the scene in a way that a different track would not have, and it stayed in the finished episode. Tiny Tim died on November 30th, 1996 at the age of 64 while performing on stage at a charity concert in Minneapolis, collapsing mid-performance and passing away a short time later at a hospital. His death came 2.5 years before Help Wanted ever aired, and the management of his recording catalog passed to his estate. When Nickelodeon attempted to secure the rights to include Help Wanted in the Season 1 DVD, the licensing for the Tiny Tim track could not be resolved in a way that allowed commercial home video distribution, and rather than include the episode with the song removed or replaced, the decision was made to leave the episode out of the collection entirely. The result was that the founding episode of one of the most commercially successful children's franchises in American entertainment history was effectively locked away from home video sale for several years, available to watch on television but impossible to purchase. The episode eventually appeared on other disc releases, including the complete third season DVD, a placement that continues to puzzle fans who encounter it without knowing the context, and was later included in larger compilation collections. By the time digital streaming made the licensing situation less of an obstacle, the episode had been available in various forms for years, and the gap in the original Season 1 set had become a well-documented piece of the show's production history. What remains genuinely unreleased is the earlier recording, the one made in 1997, before anyone at Nickelodeon caught the trademark problem, with Tom Kenny saying a name that SpongeBob was never allowed to keep. That recording exists somewhere in the history of the show's development, made by a full cast who had no idea their work would be completely redone weeks later. The story it was meant to tell eventually aired and became famous. The version that was completed first, the one that started the whole thing, under a different name, has simply never been seen by anyone outside the production, sitting somewhere in the archive of a show that has otherwise been cataloged and analyzed in extraordinary detail by fans who have spent decades studying its every frame. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that a show built partly around the idea that anyone can find their place if they show up with enough heart and enough talent began its own life with its main character stripped of his name before a single frame had been broadcast. Sponge Boy became SpongeBob because a cleaning company got there first, and the recording of who he was supposed to be has never surfaced. Every viewer who has ever watched Help Wanted and heard Tom Kenny say that name was hearing a second take, a correction, a version the show made because the first one was no longer allowed to exist. The original is still out there somewhere, in whatever form production archives survive, carrying the voice of a character who briefly had a different name and a show that was almost called something else entirely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show's first episode exists in 2 recorded versions, only one of which has ever been heard, and even that one couldn't be sold on disc for years. 40 seconds of a completely different episode share a quieter version of the same fate. Section 2, Just One Bite. 40 seconds of footage disappeared from one of the most beloved episodes in the show's entire catalog, and the network that made the decision has never said a word about why. No official statement was ever released. No press release acknowledged that anything had been changed. The scene was simply gone from most copies of the episode from a certain point onward, and what had been there before took years to resurface in a form clear enough for most viewers to study closely. What that scene contained, and when it was cut, and what was happening in the country at the time the decision was made, tells a story that the show itself never confirmed and has never needed to. Just One Bite aired on October 5th, 2001, as part of a broadcast event Nickelodeon called Totally Twisted Telly. The episode was paired with another installment called The Bully, and the two ran together in a single block that evening. The premise of Just One Bite is built around a simple comedic truth about Squidward, the show's permanently dissatisfied neighbor and co-worker, a character defined more than anything else by the gap between how sophisticated he believes his tastes to be and how completely his actual circumstances fail to reflect that belief. Squidward has spent every episode preceding this one dismissing the Krabby Patty without ever having tried one, treating SpongeBob's enthusiasm for the food he cooks as just another example of the sponge's inability to recognize the difference between something genuinely worthwhile and something merely popular. He considers himself above the product he is paid to sell. SpongeBob, whose entire identity is built around his job and the food he makes, finds this attitude genuinely painful. He wants Squidward to try one. He asks repeatedly. He presents the food with the same care and attention a person would give to something they considered a genuine masterpiece, which is exactly how SpongeBob does consider it. Squidward refuses each time with barely contained contempt, and the episode's central conflict is set in motion the moment Squidward, worn down and finally cornered into taking a single bite in a moment of weakness, discovers something he immediately regrets knowing. The Krabby Patty is extraordinary. He has been wrong about it for years, and the worst part of this realization, from Squidward's perspective, is that SpongeBob is there to witness it. The episode turns on the question of how far Squidward will go to hide this discovery from SpongeBob while simultaneously feeding the obsession it has ignited in him. His attempts to get another Krabby Patty without admitting that he wants one escalate through a series of increasingly convoluted failures. He places a fake order under a false customer name, which SpongeBob cheerfully eats himself when no one claims it. He retrieves a half-eaten patty from a trash can, which SpongeBob solemnly burns, explaining that a Krabby Patty should never be treated that way. He dreams about them at night, a sequence that gives the episode one of its stranger visual moments, and wakes up more desperate than before. Every path he tries to take toward the food, without acknowledging that he wants it, leads directly back to the same humiliation. The episode's final act is the part that changed. In the original version, as it aired on October 5th, 2001, once the restaurant closes for the night, Squidward sneaks back, alone. He approaches the locked building with the specific, slightly manic focus of someone who has been denied something long enough that the denial itself has become the whole story. He examines the door. He notes the building's security system. The security system, as it turns out, is a bucket of liquid hanging at head height above the entrance. Squidward assumes it is water. He kicks the door open. The bucket falls. The liquid drenches him, and he sniffs it with growing dread as he realizes it is not water at all. A robotic mechanical arm descends from above and drops a lit match into the gasoline pooled around him. The explosion sends him flying. He recovers and approaches the kitchen door to try again. The same thing happens again. A second bucket, a second soaking, a second match, a second explosion. Squidward staggers through the fire and into the kitchen in a state of scorched disarray, now standing in front of the patty vault, the locked strong room where finished Krabby Patties are stored, and the episode's final sequence begins. Those two explosions total approximately 40 seconds of screen time. They are played entirely for comedy, a slapstick gag built around escalating physical misfortune, the kind of cartoon violence the show deployed regularly throughout its first several seasons. There is nothing in the scene that reads as genuinely disturbing on its own terms. Squidward survives both explosions intact, consistent with the show's standard treatment of cartoon physics, and the gag's logic is simple enough that any child watching it would register it as punishment for stubbornness rather than as anything darker. The scene was not unprecedented in terms of its content. The show had run similar physical comedy throughout its run without issue. At some point after that first broadcast, the scene was removed. The exact date when the edited version began airing is not settled with complete precision across all available sources, though most accounts that have tracked it point to the change being in place across US reruns within roughly the following year, and possibly earlier. The version of the episode that most American viewers would encounter in syndication, on DVD, and on streaming services showed Squidward sneaking to the restaurant, approaching the door, and then cutting directly to him already inside the kitchen in front of the patty vault, skipping the entire security system sequence without any acknowledgement that anything had been removed. The transition is abrupt enough that viewers who had not seen the original version had no obvious reason to notice a gap. The episode's broadcast order was also quietly adjusted when the edited version replaced the original. When Just One Bite first aired alongside The Bully on October 5, 2001, The Bully ran first and Just One Bite came second. In all subsequent US airings of the edited version, that order is reversed, with Just One Bite running first. The change in ordering is understood by fans who have tracked it closely as a marker allowing anyone paying attention to know immediately which version of the episode they are watching, though the network never stated this explicitly. It functions as an unofficial signal built into the broadcast without any accompanying explanation. What happened in the weeks immediately before this episode aired is the context that most discussion of the removed scene eventually arrives at. The episode broadcast on October 5, 2001, which was less than 4 weeks after the September 11th attacks. In the weeks following that morning, a significant number of American media outlets and networks were quietly reviewing their upcoming content for anything that might be perceived as uncomfortable or inappropriate against the backdrop of what had just happened. The decision-making process that governed what got adjusted and what stayed in place during that period was handled network by network and often show by show, and it was rarely made public in detail. Most of the changes made to television content in that period went unannounced, the result of quiet internal reviews rather than policy statements that anyone outside the building would ever see. Nickelodeon made several adjustments to programming during this period. One of the most documented involved a sequence in a different SpongeBob episode called Shanghaied, where a brief visual gag depicting a pair of towers in flames as part of a background shot was removed from all subsequent airings, a change directly traceable to the imagery's obvious connection to what had just happened. The reasoning behind that specific edit was clear enough that it has been widely discussed and documented, and the connection between the imagery and the decision was never seriously disputed by anyone studying it. The reasoning behind the Just One Bite gasoline scene is less settled. Nickelodeon never confirmed that the cut was made in response to September 11th, and it has never offered any alternative explanation. Some accounts from fans and writers who have looked at the episode's history have argued that the scene was cut because of concerns about children imitating the use of gasoline and fire, a category of content that networks took seriously during that era, independent of any external events. Others have argued that the proximity to September 11th and the specific imagery of a fire explosion playing on a children's network less than a month after fire had destroyed 2 buildings in Lower Manhattan was the more likely driver. Both explanations are plausible. Neither has been confirmed. A third possibility, raised by sources connected to the show's own production history, is that the scene was cut for time or pacing reasons unrelated to either of the above, a purely editorial decision made independently of the content's specific imagery. This explanation has been noted noted in discussions on fan forums and community resources that track the show's production, with some contributors citing an account suggesting the scene was removed purely because it was felt to slow the episode down. That framing has been treated skeptically by others, who point out that the cut left an abrupt, slightly jarring transition in the middle of the episode's final act, one that would be unlikely to survive an editorial review aimed at improving pacing, since removing content that creates a visible jump cut does not obviously serve that goal. What complicates all of these theories is the fact that the scene did not disappear from every copy of the episode worldwide. Foreign dubbing of the show during this period was handled at different times and under different broadcast standards depending on the country, and several international versions of Just One Bite retained the gasoline sequence intact. Canadian airings on channels including YTV and Nickelodeon Canada continued to show the unedited version for some time after US reruns had switched to the cut version. Some South Korean broadcasts were also reported to retain the scene. The uneven international distribution of the edit is consistent with a decision made within Nickelodeon's US operations that was either not communicated to international broadcasting partners quickly enough for them to implement the same change, or was never intended to apply to markets outside North America. The scene itself circulated online in the years following its removal from US broadcasts, passed along through fan communities that tracked the show's censorship history and the evolving landscape of user-uploaded video content that made clips like this increasingly easy to find without needing access to an original broadcast recording. When it resurfaced with enough clarity for a wider audience to view it easily, a significant number of viewers encountering it were people who had grown up watching Just One Bite in its edited form and had no idea the scene existed. The reaction split along predictable lines, with some finding the cut absurd given how mild the content actually is by adult standards, and others finding it more understandable once the timeline around its removal was laid out. The irony sitting at the center of the whole situation is that the scene's removal ultimately gave it more attention than it would have received if it had simply stayed in the episode. A 40-second slapstick gag about a bucket of gasoline, played completely straight as cartoon punishment, is not the kind of content that generates sustained discussion on its own merits. It would have been seen, laughed at, and forgotten in roughly the same way as any other minor physical comedy bit from the show's early seasons. By disappearing from most copies of the episode without explanation, it transformed into something that people sought out specifically. A small piece of deliberately hidden material whose existence had to be verified, whose content had to be found, and whose removal had to be explained, none of which required anything more than the simple fact of its absence. Just One Bite itself has aged into one of the show's most consistently praised episodes, sitting near the top of multiple fan-compiled rankings of the series' best installments. It is remembered primarily for the quality of Squidward's performance across the episode, the specific comedic timing of his attempts to hide his desire while being eaten alive by it, and for the sequence at the end where his obsession finally catches up with him in a way that manages to be visually absurd and oddly satisfying at the same time. Almost none of the discussion around the episode's legacy centers on the deleted scene, which never made it into the version most viewers know. The cut material remains a footnote, a documented absence at the edge of a much larger conversation about what the episode actually achieved. The network's silence about why the scene was removed has never broken. No writer on the episode has offered a definitive public account. No Nickelodeon representative has addressed it, and the specific reasoning that led someone inside the network to decide that those 40 seconds needed to come out has not been confirmed from any direction. What is certain is that an episode aired one way on October 5th, 2001, and that most people who have seen it since have seen a different version, shorter by less than a minute, with a gap in the middle where something used to be, and the show simply jumping forward as though it was never there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 40 seconds of cartoon fire vanished from a beloved episode, and the reason was never officially confirmed. Next comes a full episode that was not edited or trimmed, but banned outright in multiple countries, not because of what it showed, but because of what other people decided it meant. Section 3. Rockabye Bivalve. 6 countries decided to keep a SpongeBob episode off the air, not because of what the episode actually contained, but because of what they decided the episode was saying between the lines. No character in Rockabye Rockabye Bivalve ever declares anything about their identity. No speech is made, no political position is staked. Two cartoon characters find a baby scallop and decide to raise it together, one taking on the role of mother and the other the role of father. And within the logic of the episode, that is the entire situation. The episode is a domestic comedy about household labor and the unequal distribution of childcare, the kind of premise that would be recognizable to any adult who has argued with a partner about who last changed a diaper. The controversy that attached itself to it had nothing to do with any of that, and everything to do with who the two characters doing the parenting happened to be. Rockabye Bivalve is a season 3 episode that first aired on October 4th, 2002. Its setup is brief. SpongeBob and Patrick are outside playing with rubber bands from their morning newspapers when they hear a small sound coming from a coral tree nearby and discover a baby scallop sitting alone with no parent in sight. Neither of them questions for even a second what they should do. Patrick immediately assumes the role of father. SpongeBob takes on the role of mother, and the two of them carry the scallop, now named Junior, back to SpongeBob's pineapple to begin raising it together. A neighbor walking past sees them and comments warmly that they make an adorable family. And the episode proceeds from there as a fairly straightforward examination of how quickly the romance of new parenthood gives way to the exhaustion of actually doing it. SpongeBob takes on the cooking, the cleaning, the feeding, and the overnight care almost from the start. Patrick, who has appointed himself the breadwinner of this domestic arrangement, goes off to work each morning carrying a briefcase. The joke, which the episode builds towards slowly enough that it earns the payoff, is that Patrick's work consists entirely of sitting under his rock watching television. He is not working. He is avoiding responsibility while SpongeBob does everything. And when SpongeBob eventually reaches his breaking point and confronts Patrick about it, the argument that follows is recognizable as the kind of disagreement real couples have about labor and contribution and fairness, played through the filter of two cartoon characters who happen to be a sea sponge and a starfish. The episode resolves when Junior learns to fly and sets off on its own, leaving SpongeBob and Patrick watching it go. Patrick's final line, delivered with the same breezy sincerity that defines his character across the entire series, is that they should have another. The show's writers have consistently described the episode as a parody of marriage and parenthood, rather than any kind of statement about the specific gender or sexuality of the characters involved. The humor is aimed at the institution of domestic partnership and the roles people fall into within it, not at the identities of SpongeBob and Patrick. The show had built their friendship across multiple seasons as genuinely warm and openly affectionate in the way that only the most sincere, uncomplicated friendships between people who truly like each other can be. And that warmth was always understood by the writers as the foundation of their dynamic, rather than any kind of coded meaning. Hillenburg himself had addressed the question of SpongeBob's sexuality before this episode ever aired, stating publicly in 2002 that SpongeBob is asexual, explaining that real sea sponges reproduce asexually, and that the character was designed to reflect that aspect of his biology. From Hillenburg's perspective, the question of whether SpongeBob had a sexual identity at all was the wrong one to ask. None of that context reached the broadcasters and government bodies in several countries who decided, without asking for clarification from the show's creators, that Rockabye Bivalve was promoting something their audiences should not see. Russia was among the countries that chose not to broadcast the episode, a decision that sat within a broader pattern of media restriction that would eventually grow considerably more formalized over the following decade, as Russian federal law expanded its prohibitions around content deemed to depict non-traditional relationships. France chose not to air it. Poland, Romania, Italy, and Greece each declined to broadcast it as well. The specific legal or regulatory framework cited in each country varied, and in some cases, the decision appeared to come from the broadcaster rather than from a government body, but the effect was the same across all of them. Audiences in those countries simply did not see the episode through standard broadcast means. The cultural context of 2002 is worth understanding clearly to make sense of why a fairly gentle 11 minutes of cartoon parenting generated this kind of response. In several of the countries that declined to air the episode, the early 2000s were a period period of active and sometimes heated public debate about family structure, same-sex relationships, and their representation in media. Countries across Eastern and Southern Europe were navigating changing social attitudes against a backdrop of conservative religious institutions, particularly Catholic and Orthodox churches, that held significant public influence over media and cultural norms. Broadcasting an episode depicting two male characters in a parenting role, even if that role was comedic and the characters were a sponge and a starfish with no stated sexuality, was enough to trigger the kind of complaints from religious and parent groups that broadcasters were often unwilling to invite. The path of least resistance in those environments was simply to not schedule the episode. The American response to the episode was considerably different, but not without its own noise. A Christian advocacy organization called Focus on the Family, which monitored children's media for content it considered to be promoting non-traditional family structures, took note of the episode and flagged it among examples of what it described as a pattern in children's programming. The specific objection was built around the same reading of the episode that had led foreign broadcasters to pull it. The argument that two male characters raising a child together was effectively an endorsement of same-sex parenting, regardless of whether the episode said so explicitly. Nickelodeon did not respond to that criticism by pulling the episode in the United States, and Rockabye Bivalve aired without interruption on American television, where it continued to rerun throughout the show's broadcast history and was included in home video releases without issue. The episode was not the only piece of SpongeBob content that attracted this kind of reading during the same era of the show. An episode from Season 2 called The Fry Cook Games, which places SpongeBob and Patrick against each other in a series of food preparation competitions styled after the Olympic Games, ends with the two reconciling after their rivalry and walking away hand in hand. The image of two characters holding hands in a moment of restored friendship is entirely unremarkable by the show's own emotional logic, consistent with the warmth that had always defined their dynamic. But it was enough for some of the same broadcasting decisions to be made in countries that had already declined Rockabye Bivalve. The reading being applied was not one that required explicit content or stated positions. It required only the presence of two male characters expressing affection for each other in any visible form. The show's response to all of this was essentially to continue making episodes without adjusting anything about the relationship between its two lead characters. SpongeBob and Patrick remained exactly as close, exactly as openly fond of each other, and exactly as willing to express that fondness across subsequent seasons, with no apparent attempt by the writing staff to calibrate their dynamic in response to complaints from foreign broadcasters or domestic advocacy groups. The writers knew what the relationship was meant to be, and had no interest in redesigning it to satisfy readings they had never intended. Hillenburg had built the show around the idea that SpongeBob and Patrick were best friends in the most complete sense of the phrase. Two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company without complicated agendas or reserves. And that foundation was not something the production was willing to alter. The broader question that Rockabye Bivalve put on the table, one that the episode itself never tried to answer, was where the line sits between a piece of children's media depicting something and a piece of children's media endorsing it. The foreign broadcasters who pulled the episode were operating from the premise that showing a situation is the same as advocating for it, that placing two male characters in a parenting role was inherently a statement in favor of same-sex parenting, regardless of the comedic context around it. The show's creators were operating from the opposite premise, that depicting a domestic situation through two familiar cartoon characters for the purpose of making jokes about unequal labor division was not a political act and did not require a political response. Both positions proceeded from the same episode and arrived at completely different conclusions about what the episode was doing. Fan reception to the episode in the countries where it did air was warm, without being particularly attentive to the surrounding controversy. Rockabye Bivalve has consistently ranked among the more fondly remembered Season 3 entries in fan-compiled lists, appreciated primarily for the domestic comedy it delivers, and for Patrick's performance across the episode, which captures something specific and funny about a character who has genuinely good intentions and almost no capacity for follow-through. The ending in particular, with Junior flying away and Patrick immediately suggesting they start the whole process over, lands as one of those jokes that works because it is so completely completely in character that it feels inevitable rather than written. The episode does what it set out to do as a piece of comedy, without the material needing to carry any additional significance. Steven Hillenburg died in November of 2018 after a battle with ALS, roughly 16 years after Rockabye Bivalve first aired, and in the coverage of his passing, the episode came up repeatedly as an example of the show's willingness to find humor in universal human situations without worrying about whether the characters delivering the jokes fit the conventional mold of a family comedy. His original insistence that SpongeBob was asexual was cited in multiple retrospective accounts as evidence of how completely he had thought through the logic of the character he created, not as an avoidance of the controversy that followed, but as a genuine reflection of how he understood the world he was building. For Hillenburg, the ocean was full of creatures that reproduced and lived in ways that did not map onto human categories, and putting human emotions and social dynamics onto those creatures without pretending they were human was the essential creative tension that made the show work. SpongeBob and Patrick could raise a baby scallop together because two characters with no stated biology raising a foundling was a funny premise that said something real about the work of caring for something helpless. What it was not, in his telling, was an argument about anything. The episode remained banned in several of the countries that originally declined to air it for years after its initial broadcast. By the time the show's later seasons were being produced and the franchise had expanded into multiple spin-offs and theatrical films, the international broadcast map for Rockabye Bivalve still had gaps in it that the original controversy had created and that changing social attitudes had not fully closed. The cultural and legal landscape around the specific content that made the episode objectionable had shifted significantly in some of those countries and very little in others, and the episode's place in each territory's broadcast history remained more complicated than its own modest content would suggest warranted. What the episode left behind in the wider culture was a moment of genuine clarity about something the show had never explicitly addressed and had never needed to, namely, that warmth between characters who are coded as male could be read as a statement, even when no statement was intended. The writers did not put that question there. The broadcasters who pulled the episode did, by deciding that the question was being asked, whether the show had raised it or not. Rockabye Bivalve became controversial not because of what was in it, but because of what other people brought to it. Reading a domestic comedy about parenthood and unequal labor as a political position the show was staking and needed to answer for. The show has never answered for it. It simply kept running. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Banned internationally on the basis of a reading the writers never intended, and the show kept running around it without comment. What Follows ran for 15 years without incident, before quietly disappearing from rotation with no explanation offered. Section 4. Midlife Crustacean. For 15 years, nobody at Nickelodeon publicly raised a concern about this episode. It aired on American television in January of 2003, ran in regular rotation across all of the network's broadcast and cable platforms, appeared on home video releases, and became one of the more frequently discussed installments of the show's third season, remembered warmly by fans for a line of dialogue that would eventually become one of the most reproduced pieces of SpongeBob dialogue on the internet. Then, sometime in August of 2018, it quietly stopped airing. No announcement accompanied the decision, no statement explained it. The episode simply disappeared from the rotation, and the network said nothing about it for nearly 3 years. Midlife Crustacean is the second segment of the 15th episode of Season 3. It premiered in Canada on November 6, 2002, and reached American audiences on January 24, 2003, airing on a Friday afternoon as part of the show's regular broadcast slot. The premise is one of the more grounded setups the show attempted during this period, built around a genuinely recognizable human experience filtered through the show's usual cartoon logic. Mr. Krabs' Krabs wakes up one morning and finds that he cannot motivate himself to get out of bed. The energy that usually drives him, the relentless hunger for profit, and the constant vigilance about money that defines his entire personality has gone quiet overnight. He drags himself to the Krusty Krab and spends his shift moving through it with a flatness that concerns SpongeBob more than the building being on firewood. The specific detail that pushes Krabs from vague dissatisfaction into genuine crisis is a casual, throwaway comment from a customer who looks at the daily special and describes it as old and dried out, a description the episode makes clear Krabs takes as a comment about himself rather than the food. He begins noticing age everywhere he looks. Young fish walk past the restaurant carrying surfboards and radios, while Krabs stands in his office feeling the weight of every year he has ever lived. A conversation with his own reflection produces no reassurance. By the time SpongeBob arrives to check on him, Krabs has arrived at the conclusion that he needs to feel young again and is willing to accept help from almost anyone in achieving that. SpongeBob and Patrick commit to the project with total sincerity, as they commit to everything. They spend the first half of the episode taking Krabs through a series of activities they consider the absolute definition of youthful fun, none of which produce the effect they are going for. A trip to a playground ends with Krabs watching Patrick slide down a slide while feeling no younger than before. A stop at an ice cream parlor provides brief enjoyment that fades almost immediately. Krabs participates in each activity with the game, but increasingly hollow effort of someone going through the motions without believing in the exercise. The activities SpongeBob has curated for this mission reflect his own understanding of what constitutes excitement, which bears essentially no relationship to the kind of excitement Krabs is actually missing. The episode's turning point arrives when Patrick announces the real plan for the evening, the activity that will, in his estimation, finally deliver the authentic thrill Krabs has been searching for. Patrick frames it as a panty raid, a term he uses with complete confidence and zero self-awareness, as though this is a perfectly ordinary suggestion rather than a plan to break into a private home and steal underwear from a stranger's dresser. Krabs, who had been responding to every previous suggestion with barely concealed boredom, responds to this one with a sudden, visible lift in his demeanor. Something in the phrase lands for him in a way the playground and the ice cream did not. He agrees immediately, and the three of them set off in the dark. The sequence that follows shows the three characters sneaking through a darkened neighborhood and climbing through a window into a house, moving through the interior to a bedroom dresser and removing a pair of underwear from a drawer, an act committed with the specific kind of conspiratorial excitement that only people doing something they know they should not be doing can generate. The scene plays the whole thing as a comedic caper, the kind of stealthy, poorly planned adventure that is filmed with the same frantic energy the show used for any other low-stakes scheme. The humor is not presented as coming from the violation of anyone's privacy, but from the absurdity of the situation and the mismatched energy of the three participants, with Krabs briefly recapturing something that feels like youth, while SpongeBob and Patrick treat the whole thing as a favor to a friend. The reveal arrives when the lights in the house come on, and the owner descends to find three intruders standing in her bedroom. The owner is Mama Krabs, Mr. Krabs' mother, and SpongeBob and Patrick, it becomes clear, knew exactly whose house they were entering, and did not think to mention this to Krabs before leading him through the window. Mama Krabs reacts with the calm authority of a parent who has seen worse. She does not call the police or express shock. She simply looks at her son and sends him to his room for the rest of the night, with the kind of unruffled parental finality that removes any possibility of argument. Krabs, who had briefly been feeling young again, is now being sent to bed by his mother. The episode lands its punchline from exactly this reversal, the pursuit of youth ending in the most infantilizing possible outcome. SpongeBob follows Krabs to his childhood bedroom to check on him and offers an apology. Krabs forgives him and then delivers the observation that ends the episode, noting that spending the night in his childhood bedroom actually does make him feel younger, finding the thing he had been looking for by accident in precisely the place place he had been trying to escape. It is a genuinely decent closing note for an episode that could easily have ended more abruptly, and it was received warmly by critics and fans in the years immediately following its initial broadcast. The episode is also the origin of a line that went on to generate a second life completely independent of the episode's reputation. Early in the story, as SpongeBob is trying to understand what kind of fun Krabs is missing, he asks whether Krabs is feeling it, using a slightly different formulation that the internet eventually collapsed into the phrase, "Are you feeling it now, Mr. Krabs?" A question that circulated across social media platforms for years as a reaction image and a caption format, detached entirely from the panty raid plot and associated almost exclusively with the specific expression on Krabs' face in the scene where SpongeBob poses it. By the time the episode was pulled from rotation in 2018, this meme had already ensured that midlife crustacean occupied a specific, comfortable corner of the show's popular legacy among viewers who had grown up with it. The removal caught many of those same viewers off guard. The decision to pull the episode from rotation was made quietly and without any public communication. Nickelodeon did not issue a statement when the episode stopped airing in August of 2018. The change was noticed first by fans who tracked the show's scheduling and flagged the episode's absence on community forums and discussion boards, comparing broadcast listings and confirming that the episode had stopped appearing. The network's silence extended through 2019 and 2020 without any official acknowledgement that the episode had been removed or that a review had taken place. The situation became public knowledge in March of 2021 when IGN reported on the status of the episode, alongside the separately announced removal of Quarantined Crab from streaming for COVID-related reasons. A representative from Nickelodeon confirmed to IGN at that point that Midlife Crustacean had been out of rotation since 2018, following a standards review in which the network determined that some story elements were not appropriate for children. The representative declined to specify which story elements had triggered that determination, and when asked whether the network had considered alternatives, such as adding a viewer advisory rather than removing the episode entirely, the response was a flat refusal to comment. The standards review referenced in that statement was conducted internally and has never been described in detail through any public-facing communication from the network. The most widely accepted explanation, drawn from the content of the episode itself, centers on the panty raid sequence. Breaking into a private home to steal underwear from a woman's bedroom dresser, framed as a comedic adventure for 3 cartoon characters and played entirely for laughs, sits in a different cultural register in the years following the public reckoning about harassment and consent that defined American media discourse in late 2017 and 2018. The behavior depicted in the sequence, even in its cartoonish, completely consequence-free form, became harder to defend as harmless entertainment for children once the cultural conversation around consent had shifted sufficiently to make the premise itself feel like an endorsement of the wrong thing. The hashtag #MeToo movement, which had become a major public force in late 2017, had by 2018 prompted a widespread reassessment of entertainment content that depicted or normalized behavior toward women that had previously been passed over without comment. This reassessment reached children's media as well as adult programming, and it produced a number of quiet content reviews at various networks that resulted in adjustments to older material. Nickelodeon's review of its SpongeBob catalog in the period leading up to the August 2018 removal of Midlife Crustacean fits within that broader pattern, though the network never explicitly stated the connection. Fan response to the removal divided fairly quickly along lines that reflected broader cultural arguments rather than assessments of the episode's specific content. Some viewers argued that the panty raid scene was clearly comedic, and that removing it from a cartoon that had aired for 15 years without any reported harm was an overcorrection born of cultural anxiety rather than a genuine content concern. Others argued that the specific nature of the behavior depicted, 3 characters breaking into a woman's home to steal her underwear, was exactly the kind of material that should not be presented as cheerful adventure content for the age group watching SpongeBob. Regardless regardless of how long it had been airing without challenge. Both positions circulated extensively in the online discussions that followed IGN's reporting, and neither fully persuaded the other. The episode was also removed from digital purchase platforms including Amazon Prime Video sometime around the same period, meaning that viewers who had not already purchased or downloaded it could not legally obtain a copy through standard commercial channels for a stretch of time. Physical home media releases that had been manufactured and sold prior to the removal continued to circulate through secondhand markets and remained in libraries and personal collections, meaning the episode was not genuinely inaccessible in the way that truly suppressed content tends to be. Its status was closer to a quiet commercial withdrawal than a deletion. That status shifted again in July of 2023 when both Midlife Crustacean and Quarantined Crab were restored to the streaming catalog on Paramount Plus, with no accompanying statement explaining why the decision had been made to bring them back at that particular point. The return of the episode generated its own round of coverage and discussion, with commentators noting that nothing about the episode's content had changed, and that the cultural conversation around the specific behavior it depicted had not obviously shifted in a direction that would make the panty raid sequence less objectionable than it had been during the 5-year period of its removal. The network offered no explanation for the reversal, maintaining the same silence it had kept about the original decision. What Midlife Crustacean demonstrated over the course of its 15-year run, its 5-year removal, and its eventual return is how dramatically the same piece of content can shift in perceived acceptability without a single frame of it changing. The episode that aired in January of 2003 and generated warm reviews is the same episode that failed a standards review in 2018. The episode that was deemed not appropriate for children in 2018 is the same episode returned to a children's streaming service in 2023. Nothing about the animation changed. Nothing about the dialogue changed. Nothing about the panty raid changed. What changed was the interpretive frame the people making decisions about it were working within, and that frame shifted twice in opposite directions across 20 years, carrying the episode with it each time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 15 years of broadcast, 5 years of removal, a return with nothing said about either. Next, a real pandemic arrives 2 years after a cartoon accidentally wrote the same one into its plot. Section 5. Quarantined Crab. Nobody writing a SpongeBob episode in 2018 was thinking about a real pandemic. The writers who developed Quarantined Crab during that production cycle were working on a season 12 story about the Krusty Krab being shut down due to an illness scare, a premise built around the show's long history of treating the restaurant as a pressure cooker, where its small cast of recurring characters gets trapped together and forced to interact badly. The clam flu, as the episode named its fictional illness, was a device, a plot mechanism designed to lock a group of people in a room and watch them turn on each other. It was not a prediction. It was not a commentary. It was a cartoon about a fast food restaurant staffed by a sponge and managed by a crab. And the writers finished it and moved on to the next one. Then, the real world caught up with the script in a way that nobody could have anticipated, and the episode spent more than 2 years sitting on a shelf while the thing it accidentally resembled consumed the entire planet. Quarantined Crab is the second segment of the 22nd episode of Season 12. The season itself began airing on November 11th, 2018, and most of its episodes reached American television on a reasonably standard schedule throughout 2019 and into 2020. Quarantined Crab was among the episodes slated for broadcast in 2020 and was included in the Season 12 DVD set released in the United States on January 12, 2021, though with one notable exception. When that disc arrived in stores, it contained every other episode from the season except this one. The episode had been removed from the physical release before it went to manufacturing, an unusual and visible sign that something specific about it had triggered a different kind of handling. The episode opens with the Krusty Krab receiving a visit from a health inspector, a recurring type of character in the show's history, given that the restaurant's food safety record has been a running joke across multiple seasons. This inspector is there to check for signs of the clam flu, a contagious illness described in the episode as spreading rapidly through Bikini Bottom and posing posing a genuine public health concern. He finds what he is looking for almost immediately. The inspector announces that the Krusty Krab is under quarantine and that everyone inside at the time of his visit, SpongeBob, Squidward, Mr. Krabs, Patrick, Pearl, and Mrs. Puff, must remain inside the building until the situation is resolved. Nobody is allowed to leave. What follows is a fairly standard bottle episode structure, the kind the show had used effectively in other installments to generate conflict between a small group of characters stuck together in a confined space. The quarantine setting allows the episode to push each character's specific anxieties and personality traits against each other in ways that escalate as the runtime progresses. Mr. Krabs, whose primary concern is always financial, becomes preoccupied with keeping the restaurant open and generating revenue, even from inside a health quarantine. Squidward's irritation reaches new heights as he realizes there is no exit. Patrick begins behaving with an increasingly erratic logic about who might be infected and who might not be. And Mrs. Puff, already a character defined by barely contained stress, finds the situation genuinely unbearable. The episode develops a paranoia thread as the characters begin to suspect each other of carrying the illness, a dynamic that pushes the plot towards something darker than the show's usual tone. When Mr. Krabs announces that anyone suspected of having the clam flu should be isolated in the restaurant's freezer to protect everyone else, the episode tips into territory that reads as social commentary on how communities treat the sick and the suspected, with the freezer functioning as a quarantine within the quarantine, a place people get sent not because they are proven sick, but because someone has decided they might be. SpongeBob and Patrick, predictably, end up in the freezer before long. The episode does not resolve this strand with particular moral clarity, leaning instead toward the comedic chaos the show normally favored over any kind of pointed conclusion. All of this was written, produced, and finished in 2018 and early 2019. The COVID-19 pandemic was first identified publicly in December of 2019 and was declared a global pandemic by the World Health Organization on March 11, 2020. By that point, Nickelodeon was already aware that Quarantined Crab was somewhere in its broadcast schedule for season 12, and the network made a decision that required no extended debate. On March 27, 2020, IGN reported that the episode would not be airing as previously scheduled. A spokesperson for Nickelodeon confirmed the decision in a statement that was brief and to the point, saying that the episode centered on a virus storyline and that the network had decided not to air it due to sensitivities surrounding the global, real-world pandemic. No other details were offered. The timing of that decision placed it within a period of extreme public anxiety about an illness that had just begun shutting down cities, overwhelming hospitals, and killing people at a scale that made entertainment depicting quarantine feel genuinely uncomfortable rather than absurdly fictional. Nickelodeon's choice to pull the episode was not unique within the media landscape. Several other networks and streaming platforms made similar adjustments to programming during that period, pulling or delaying content that depicted infectious disease, quarantine, or mass illness in ways that might land differently against the backdrop of a real global health emergency. The calculation was straightforward enough in most cases, even if the content was clearly fictional and clearly comedic. Putting it in front of an audience currently living through something uncomfortably similar to its premise served no obvious purpose and risked generating coverage the network did not want. What added a layer of complexity to the decision about Quarantined Crab specifically was a dimension of the real pandemic's social fallout that did not exist in the fictional clam flu story. The COVID-19 pandemic was accompanied, particularly in the United States, by a significant rise in hostility directed at Asian and Asian American communities, driven by rhetoric that associated the virus with its geographic origin, and by a political culture that had introduced and repeated language attaching ethnicity to disease in ways that contributed to a measurable increase in discrimination and violence. Several commentators who wrote about Nickelodeon's decision to pull the episode in March of 2021 noted this dimension, alongside the more obvious content similarity, pointing out that an episode depicting characters turning on each other inside a quarantine and isolating those they suspected of carrying illness had an additional resonance in 2020 and 2021 that the writers could not have foreseen when the episode was produced. The episode did reach audiences outside the United States during the period when it was being withheld from American broadcast. France aired it on May 6, 2020, roughly 6 weeks after Nickelodeon confirmed it would not be broadcast in the US, making French audiences among the first to see it in its country of origin's broadcast language. Other international markets followed at various points over the following months. The uneven international distribution meant that the episode existed in a halfway state for an extended period, fully produced and broadcast in some territories, while being held back in the country where the show was made. Fans who knew the episode existed and had access to international streams or recordings could find it during this period, and the episode circulated in online communities without significant difficulty. But it was not part of the official Nickelodeon US broadcast schedule. The Season 12 DVD's release on January 12, 2021, without the episode, was a visible marker of how seriously the network was treating the decision. DVD compilation sets for ongoing television series occasionally omit individual episodes for licensing or rights reasons, but the omission of a single episode from a season set for content reasons was unusual enough to generate attention. Reviews of the release noted the gap. The episode's listing on various television databases showed the gap between surrounding Season 12 entries where Quarantined Crab should have appeared, and fan communities that tracked the show closely documented the absence in detail, confirming through multiple sources that the episode had been deliberately excluded rather than accidentally overlooked. The episode finally reached American broadcast on April 29, 2022, airing on Nickelodeon and becoming the last episode of Season 12 to air in the United States, roughly 3.5 years after most of the season's other installments had already reached American audiences. Its actual production had long since been completed by then, and the show had moved through 2 additional seasons of content in the time the episode spent waiting. The April 2022 broadcast date made Quarantined Crab the final piece of Season 12 to complete its original broadcast run, closing out a season that had otherwise finished airing in the US long before this particular installment was ready to be released. The clam flu itself, as depicted in the episode, is almost comically unthreatening by the standards of what was happening in the real world while the episode sat on the shelf. It is a cartoon illness in a cartoon universe, introduced as a plot device and treated with the show's characteristic looseness around consequences. Nobody dies. Nobody suffers in any meaningful or lasting way. The episode's quarantine setting is played primarily as a source of social friction and comedic escalation, rather than as anything genuinely frightening, and the resolution arrives in the show's standard mode of chaos, giving way to an abrupt ending, rather than any carefully worked-out conclusion. Watching it after the pandemic had passed its acute phase makes the network's caution feel excessive in retrospect, which is a reaction that itself says something about the specific nature of 2020 and the way that period transformed even the most obviously fictional depictions of quarantine into something that carried more weight than was ever intended. The episode has never generated the kind of sustained critical reevaluation that some other pulled SpongeBob content has attracted. It is a competent installment of a show in its 12th season, not among the most discussed or most beloved episodes from that period, and its primary claim to distinction remains the circumstances of its release, rather than anything distinctive in the episode itself. Fans who went looking for it during its period of US unavailability found it easily through international sources and did not generally report anything about its content that justified the extended delay. The consensus view, both during the hold and after, was that the network had made a defensible call given the circumstances of 2020, and that the episode itself, content aside, was a fairly unremarkable entry in the show's catalog. What Quarantined Crab represents most clearly in the broader story of SpongeBob content that ended up somewhere it was never meant to be is the specific category of collateral damage caused by real-world events overtaking fictional ones. The episode was never written with any intention other than to produce an 11-minute cartoon about people trapped in a fast food restaurant arguing during a health scare. The people who wrote it had no way of knowing that a global pandemic was approximately 2 years away from making that premise feel uncomfortable to broadcast, and no amount of revision or rethinking on their part could have changed the situation they were eventually placed in. The timing was simply wrong in a way that nobody could have planned for or prevented. That category of unintended collision between fictional content and real-world events is one of the stranger places that creative work can end up. A space where the quality of the content and the intentions behind it become irrelevant because the external circumstances have made the content itself difficult to handle regardless. Quarantined Crab spent 2 years as a piece of media that existed but could not be shown in its home country. Not because it was harmful, not because it was poorly made, and not because anyone had objected to it on its own terms, but because the world outside the studio had, with complete indifference to the show's schedule, produced the real version of its premise while the fictional one was waiting in a drawer. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next comes an episode that was never pulled, never banned, and never officially reviewed, but that generated one of the more unusual pieces of public protest in the show's entire history from the parents of children who saw it before anyone thought to warn them what was in it. Section 6. Are you happy now? A parent sitting in another room on a Saturday morning in March of 2012 would have had no reason to feel anything other than the usual mild relief that their child was occupied and the television was doing its job. SpongeBob was on. SpongeBob had been on for 13 years by that point, rotating through the same familiar characters in the same familiar underwater town, and nothing in its broadcast history had produced the kind of moment that required a parent to walk quickly into the living room and explain what their child had just seen. The show had built up enormous trust across those years, the kind of trust that accumulates slowly through thousands of hours of content that reliably stays within expected boundaries. Then, Are You Happy Now aired on March 31st, 2012, and within days, a petition was circulating online demanding that Nickelodeon pull the episode permanently, signed by people who had caught the relevant scenes and were not particularly interested in hearing the argument that the jokes were meant to be read as comedy. Are You Happy Now is the first segment of the 17th episode of Season 8. The episode was written by Luke Brookshire, Mark Chetzolari, and Danny McKaylee, and directed by Vincent Waller, who served as a creative director on the show through a substantial portion of its later seasons. The premise begins gently enough. SpongeBob is flipping through a photo album and laughing at the pictures when Squidward asks what he finds so amusing. SpongeBob explains that he is reliving happy memories, and then asks Squidward the same question in return, wanting to know what his happiest memory is. The question seems simple. It is the kind of thing one person asks another without any expectation that the answer will be difficult to produce. Squidward pauses. He thinks. He searches backward through what the episode presents as a life filled with disappointments, unrealized ambitions, and the persistent, grinding awareness that the gap between how talented he believes himself to be and how talented anyone else considers him has never closed. He has wanted to be a celebrated artist. He has wanted recognition for his clarinet playing. He has wanted to be seen as someone whose taste and sophistication set him apart from the company he is forced to keep. None of these things have materialized in any lasting way, and as Squidward sits with SpongeBob's question, the episode plays his inability to answer it as something genuine and specific rather than as a setup for a quick joke. He cannot identify a single moment he would return to. He does not have one. SpongeBob, who understands personal problems primarily through the question of what he himself can do to fix them, immediately declares that he will help Squidward find his happiest memory. This is the kind of well-intentioned, poorly calibrated intervention that defines most of SpongeBob's attempts to improve Squidward's situation across the series. And Are You Happy Now commits to the premise with more earnestness than usual. SpongeBob does not treat the lack of happy memories as a punchline. He treats it as a genuine emergency requiring a solution, and he brings to that project the same relentless, completely unself-aware energy that drives everything he does. The attempts that follow are each designed with real thought on SpongeBob's part, and received with genuine exhaustion on Squidward's, and none of them work. A hot air balloon ride ends badly. An attempt to introduce Squidward to the music of a live snail band produces nothing. SpongeBob tries cooking a special meal, tries organizing an outing, tries finding creative outlets that might tap into whatever dormant satisfaction Squidward has locked locked away somewhere. Each attempt lands with the same flatness, Squidward present but unmoved, willing to participate without finding anything in the participation worth keeping. The episode uses this accumulation of failures not for laughs, but to build something that functions more like a portrait of genuine depression than the show typically attempted. A character going through motions that everyone around him hopes will produce change, while he himself senses with growing certainty that they will not. By the episode's midpoint, Squidward has stopped engaging entirely. He stops leaving his house. He stops answering his phone. He grows a visible stubble that the show uses as a visual shorthand for a character who has stopped caring about the maintenance of daily life, a signal the audience is meant to read as a sign of deterioration rather than a style choice. When SpongeBob calls from next door to check on him, Squidward opens the window and throws the telephone out without speaking. The episode holds on his expression for a moment before moving on, and the expression is not comedic. It is tired in a way that reads as specific and real. It is inside this section of the episode that the two scenes generating the petition appear. The first shows Squidward approaching his kitchen oven. He opens the door, puts his head inside, and says aloud that this might make him feel better. Then the camera angle shifts to show him pulling out a tray of badly burned brownies, the implication resolved into baking. The image that the audience received in the half second before the resolution disposed of harmlessly by the revelation of the food. The second scene shows Squidward in his living room, holding a length of rope with a loop at one end. He throws the loop up over the top of a piece of furniture and says that this should help things. The camera pulls back to show a bird cage attached to the other end, which he hoists into place and regards with the expression of someone who has completed a small domestic task that has not noticeably improved their mood. Both scenes are structured as bait-and-switch jokes. The setup presents one image, and the punchline resolves it into something harmless. This is a recognizable comedic construction that appears across a wide range of television comedy, including animated series aimed at adult audiences, and the writers who put these scenes into the episode understood exactly what structure they were using. The humor depends entirely on the gap between the image the setup delivers and the mundane reality the punchline substitutes for it. And the bigger the gap, the harder the joke lands for anyone who has processed the setup quickly enough to feel the mismatch. The problem that the petition captured was not the construction itself, but the specific context within which the construction was deployed. A bait-and-switch joke of this kind requires the audience to register the dark interpretation before the resolution arrives, because the joke does not work if the audience does not experience even a fraction of the discomfort the setup is designed to produce. For adult viewers with enough media literacy to immediately parse the structure as comedic, the discomfort is brief and followed by the relief of the punchline. For younger viewers, without that parsing speed, or for parents catching the setup frame before the resolution frame, the image had already been received and processed before the harmless answer arrived to replace it. The oven was the image, the brownies were the correction, but the oven was what was seen first. The Change.org petition that circulated in the days following the broadcast collected several thousand signatures and addressed itself directly to Nickelodeon, asking the network to remove the episode. The comments left by signatories were consistent in their framing. The objection was not to dark humor as a category, or to SpongeBob containing mature undertones, which the show had always carried. The objection was to a specific set of images appearing without warning in a show whose established track record had made parental preview feel unnecessary. Parents who allowed their children to watch SpongeBob unsupervised did so because 13 years of the show had not produced a moment requiring intervention. Are You Happy Now produced 2 of them in the space of a single episode. The counter-argument circulated with equal energy across the same forums and platforms where the petition was being shared. Writers and animation fans argued that the bait-and-switch construction was the entire point, that removing the dark setup would remove the joke entirely, and that treating children as incapable of processing the construction was both condescending and at odds with the show's own long history of layered, adult-accessible humor running alongside its more straightforward children's content. The show had always operated on multiple levels simultaneously, and some commentators argued that Are You Happy Now was operating on those same levels, that the dark images were meant to land for the adult viewer, while the resolutions reassured the child. Others responded that this defense assumed a viewing context, parent and child together, that did not reflect how most children actually encountered the show. Nickelodeon did not pull the episode. No official statement addressed the petition. The episode continued to air in reruns and was available on streaming platforms without any modification or advisory attached to it. The network's non-response was itself a kind of position, a decision that the episode fell within acceptable parameters that did not require the intervention the petition was requesting. Whether a standards review of the kind that eventually removed midlife crustacean was ever conducted for this episode has never been publicly confirmed either way. The writing staff's own perspective filtered out in small, oblique ways over the years that followed. Casey Alexander, who served as a writer and storyboard artist on the show during this period, responded to a fan on social media in 2015 who had expressed an unpopular positive opinion about the episode and tagged him in the post. Alexander's response described the fan as a brave soul for holding that position publicly, a comment that communicated awareness of the episode's reputation without committing to any particular view of whether the episode had handled its content appropriately. It was the kind of response that acknowledged a charged history without reopening it, and it has remained one of the few public acknowledgments from anyone connected to the episode's production that the reaction it received was anything other than standard. The episode sits within a larger arc in the show's treatment of Squidward across its later seasons, an arc that had been pushing his suffering further from broad comedic exaggeration and closer to recognizable psychological reality for several years before Are You Happy Now aired. Episodes from seasons 6, 7, and 8 had been criticized with increasing frequency for the harshness with which Squidward's misery was being depicted, with some reviewers arguing that the show had shifted from treating his unhappiness as an engine for jokes to treating it as a destination the story was content to park in without any release valve. Are You Happy Now arrived at the far end of this trajectory, taking Squidward's inability to experience happiness seriously enough that the episode spent significant time portraying what that inability actually looks like, rather than simply using it as a setup for physical gags. The ending the episode eventually delivers is one of its most discussed elements, partly because it resolves Squidward's arc in the strangest possible way, and partly because it arrives after content that made many viewers uncertain they wanted to continue watching. Unable to help Squidward through any conventional means, SpongeBob fills the Krusty Krab with several hundred papier-mâché versions of himself, substitutes for a party audience that nobody else was willing to attend. Squidward arrives to find a room full of SpongeBob faces staring at him from every angle, and his response is not the warmth the gesture was designed to produce. He destroys every single one of them. He tears them apart and smashes them with an escalating intensity that the episode plays as cathartic release, Squidward finally finding something that generates real feeling by dismantling the representation of the thing that has made his life most consistently difficult. He finishes, declares himself genuinely happy, and SpongeBob, watching the destruction, expresses shared delight that his friend has finally found peace. That ending did not find its way into the petition. The petition was specifically and entirely about the oven and the rope. Two images that appeared and resolved within seconds and left some viewers with something they had not expected to carry out of a Saturday morning cartoon. The structure the writers used had appeared in adult animation and live-action comedy without generating comparable responses. But SpongeBob was not those shows, and the trust that parents extended to it was not the same trust they extended to programming with different ratings and different audience expectations. When that trust was broken, even by scenes that resolved harmlessly, the break was felt as something specific. The episode has generated more sustained academic and critical attention than most of the show's post-Hillenburg output, becoming a point of reference in broader discussions about where children's television draws its lines around dark content and who exactly is responsible for maintaining those lines. Nickelodeon's decision not to respond to the petition and not to pull the episode established one answer to that question. The thousands of people who signed the petition were establishing a different different one. The episode continues to air, the petition stopped collecting signatures, and the answer to where the line actually sits has never been formally resolved by anyone with the authority to resolve it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. An episode that used dark imagery as the setup for harmless punchlines, generated a public petition, stayed in rotation without a single official response, and left the question of where a children's show's limits actually lie unanswered. Section 7. One-Course Meal. Season 7 of SpongeBob SquarePants arrived during what fans and critics broadly consider the show's most troubled creative stretch, a period following Stephen Hillenburg's departure from day-to-day oversight of the series after the 2004 theatrical film that produced some of the most widely criticized episodes in the franchise's history. The show during this era was not without its defenders, and not every installment from these seasons deserves the sweeping dismissal that some retrospective accounts have applied to the period as a whole. One-Course Meal, which aired on March 25th, 2010, stands apart from the general quality arguments about Season 7 because the criticism directed at it is not primarily about craft or comedic execution. The episode has accumulated more sustained negative attention than almost any other installment across the show's entire catalog because of what it chose to depict, how it chose to frame that depiction, and the complete absence of any official response to the conversation that has surrounded it for more than 15 years since it aired. The episode begins with Plankton launching another attempt to steal the Krabby Patty secret formula, deploying a new piece of machinery to capture SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs inside the Krusty Krab and hold them long enough to complete the theft. The setup is familiar to anyone who has watched more than a handful of episodes from the show's run. Plankton schemes, Krabs resists. The formula stays protected. This particular attempt is proceeding with reasonable effectiveness until Pearl, Mr. Krabs' teenage whale daughter, arrives at the restaurant. Plankton's response to her arrival is immediate and total. He drops the machinery, abandons the scheme midway through its execution, and flees back to the chum bucket in a full panic. The episode pauses to explain what the audience has just witnessed. Plankton has cetophobia, a genuine phobia of whales, and Pearl's appearance triggered it completely. He tells Karen about the encounter with the specific embarrassment of someone confessing a vulnerability they would strongly prefer remained private. Mr. Krabs finds out. He pieces together enough from Plankton's reaction in the moment to understand what he has discovered, and the episode makes an immediate and unambiguous decision about what Krabs will do with this information. He does not treat it as a single defensive advantage to deploy the next time Plankton attempts a theft. He borrows one of Pearl's dresses, constructs a whale costume around himself, and begins visiting the chum bucket under cover of darkness to stand outside Plankton's windows and terrify him while he tries to sleep. The episode shows him doing this on 16 consecutive nights. Not once, not as a warning, 16 nights of sustained, deliberate psychological cruelty directed at a character who has been specifically identified as vulnerable to exactly the kind of fear being deployed against him, conducted by someone who benefits from the incapacitation it produces and who finds the whole arrangement personally enjoyable. Plankton's condition across those 16 days is depicted with a level of specific detail that separates the episode from the show's typical handling of character suffering. His physical state deteriorates in ways the episode presents visually rather than explaining. His hair grows out, his fingernails lengthen. He stops taking care of himself in the basic ways that signal a functioning daily life because he is no longer sleeping and no longer able to maintain the ordinary routines that require a baseline of rest and stability. He begins wearing tissue boxes on his feet, and the episode makes a direct, specific reference to what this image is meant to evoke. It compares his state to Howard Hughes, the 20th century industrialist and aviator who descended into severe isolation and psychological deterioration in the later decades of his life, becoming one of the most widely documented cases of OCD and paranoia in American public life. The writers placed that reference deliberately. They knew what they were depicting and chose a real historical parallel to make the depiction more precise. The reference to Hughes is one of the stranger and more revealing choices in the episode's construction because it removes any ambiguity about the register the episode is working in during Plankton's deterioration sequence. Hughes was not a cartoon character having cartoon problems. He was a real person whose real suffering produced real consequences that shaped how he lived and eventually how he died. Invoking his specific behavioral patterns as a reference point for Plankton's condition is a choice that anchors the fictional suffering to documented human experience, and it does so in an episode airing on a children's network at a time when its audience skewed toward viewers who were unlikely to know who Howard Hughes was, and therefore unlikely to parse the reference as anything other than a weird joke about a guy in tissue box shoes. SpongeBob notices Plankton's state and intervenes. He goes to Mr. Krabs' office and raises the concern directly, asking him to stop what he is doing to Plankton. This is the scene that has generated more sustained analysis and criticism than any other moment in the episode, not because of what SpongeBob says, but because of how Krabs responds to it. Krabs does not brush SpongeBob off. He does not offer a justification or a rationalization. He does not claim that Plankton deserves what is happening or that the stakes of the Krabby Patty formula warrant this level of action. He laughs. He looks at the description of what has become of Plankton and finds it funny, visibly and specifically funny. The way something is funny when it is also satisfying. He declines to stop. SpongeBob accepts this as a closed conversation and leaves. The episode frames Krabs' position in that exchange as a conclusion rather than as a problem the narrative intends to address. SpongeBob raised a concern, Krabs dismissed it with laughter, and the scene moves on. The structure of the storytelling places the audience in the position of having watched the moral question get answered badly, and then witnessed that bad answer treated as sufficient. There is no returning to the point. There is no second intervention, no character other than SpongeBob, who registers that what is happening to Plankton is wrong, and no moment in which the episode signals that it disagrees with Krabs' position on the matter. The show does not editorialize. It moves forward. What it moves forward to is the road scene. Plankton, by the point the episode reaches this sequence, has been reduced by 16 days of manufactured terror to a state the show has never depicted for any of its characters in quite this way. He walks out of the chum bucket and into the road outside. He stands there in the path of traffic and does not move. SpongeBob is watching. The episode is not vague or ambiguous about what Plankton is doing. He is standing in a road, hoping to be struck by a vehicle, because he has decided that outcome is preferable to continuing to live with the fear that has been systematically installed in him over the past 2 weeks and 4 days. SpongeBob watches this and returns to tell Krabs what is happening outside. Krabs laughs again. The moment is not framed as slapstick. Plankton's earlier pratfalls and physical disasters across the show's run are played with the visual language of cartoon violence, fast and exaggerated, and obviously disconnected from real suffering. This scene is played differently. The visual staging is quiet. Plankton is small and still and standing in a road. SpongeBob's reaction to what he is seeing is concern rather than amusement. The scene does not generate a laugh through how it is shot or scored or timed in the way that cartoon violence sequences typically do. It sits in the episode as a moment of stillness inside a story that has spent its runtime building toward exactly this point, the logical endpoint of 16 days of sustained, targeted cruelty against someone too small and too alone to escape it. The resolution that eventually arrives does not come through care or consequence applied to Krabs. It comes through information delivered to Plankton. SpongeBob approaches him in the road and tells him that the whale responsible for his terror was never real, that the entire thing was Krabs wearing a costume, that the fear Plankton has been drowning in was manufactured by his enemy and is therefore something he can now act against rather than something he has to survive. Plankton stops what he is doing in the road. He does not stop because anyone helped him. He stops because the information gives him leverage he can use. He walks back to the chum bucket with a plan, and the episode follows that plan to a punchline in which Plankton discovers that Krabs is terrified of mimes and employs one to torment him in return. Some defenses of the episode have rested on this final sequence, arguing that Plankton's revenge on Krabs provides the moral correction the episode needed, punishing the character responsible for the abuse by turning his own vulnerability against him in the same way he had turned Plankton's against him. The argument has not satisfied most of the critics who have examined the episode in detail, for reasons that are fairly straightforward once they are stated. The revenge sequence is brief and comedic in a tone that Plankton's deterioration across the episode's main body was not. Plankton spending 2 weeks in a psychological breakdown, losing the ability to sleep, developing the behavioral patterns of a historically documented case of mental illness, and standing in a road hoping to be struck by a vehicle is not balanced by Krabs being mildly inconvenienced by a mime for the final 30 seconds of the runtime. The scales of the episode are not even, and the structural weight placed on each side makes the imbalance visible. The ending also includes a beat that undermines the reading of the revenge as a moral correction. SpongeBob, in the episode's closing moments, uses holographic whales to drive Plankton away from the Krusty Krab and protect the formula. The effect of this is that SpongeBob, who raised the only moral objection in the episode and who told Plankton the truth about the costume, ends the story by actively using Plankton's phobia against him in the same structural way Krabs had been using it, and the episode presents this as a satisfying closing beat rather than as a complication. Krabs is in exactly the same position of advantage at the end of the episode as he was at the start. Plankton has been psychologically devastated, driven to a road, given information that let him function again, and then immediately re-exposed to the fear that broke him. The episode does not register any of this as a problem. The critical record around one-course meal accumulated steadily in the years following its broadcast. Fan community reviews were among the most sustained negative responses to any SpongeBob episode outside the most immediately obvious quality failures of the era, and the reasoning they offered was consistent and specific. The episode did not simply fail as comedy. It depicted something genuinely dark, framed it without the usual cartoon distance that makes similar content manageable, and treated a character experiencing visible psychological deterioration as a source of entertainment for the antagonist responsible for that deterioration. The fact that the antagonist was a main character the audience had spent years watching did not soften this. If anything, it made it worse, because it required the audience to watch a familiar figure they had cheered for across previous episodes, laughing at a suffering they had caused. Nickelodeon has never issued any public statement about one-course meal. No standards review has been publicly confirmed. The episode has not been pulled from rotation, has not been removed from streaming platforms, and has not been subjected to any of the quiet content management that affected Midlife Crustacean, Quarantined Crab, or the Red Mist scene in SpongeBob in Random Land. It sits in the catalog without any special designation, retrievable on the same platform and under the same conditions as everything else the show has ever produced. The contrast with Are You Happy Now, which generated a public petition and was subjected to years of visible cultural discussion about whether it should remain available, is stark. Are You Happy Now used dark imagery as the setup for harmless punchlines, received immediate and loud public pushback, and stayed in rotation. One Course Meal depicted a character's genuine psychological collapse under sustained deliberate abuse, included a scene showing that character standing in traffic as a consequence of that abuse, and has never generated any comparable response from Nickelodeon at any level. The gap between these two outcomes points to something specific about how content review processes work in practice. The oven and the rope in Are You Happy Now produced an immediate visible reaction because the images were legible to a broad audience in an instant. A parent seeing those scenes for 3 seconds could identify what they depicted without context or extended engagement. The harm they communicated was surface level and fast moving, the kind that generates signatures on a petition because the objection can be expressed in a sentence. One Course Meal required sustained attention across the full runtime to fully register what was being depicted, and the harm it communicated was not legible in a single frame. It required the audience to sit with 16 days of depicted psychological cruelty, track the behavioral deterioration sequence, understand the Howard Hughes reference, read the road scene for what it was, and then watch the episode end without any meaningful moral correction applied to the character responsible. That is a different kind of harm than an oven gag, and it is slower to generate the kind of reaction that produces public pressure. Casey Alexander, one of the writers involved with the episode, offered the only public comment from any creative staff member that has entered the record around it. His response to a fan who expressed positive feelings about One Course Meal on social media in 2015 described that fan as a brave soul for holding that position publicly. The comment said nothing about the episode's specific content decisions and nothing about whether the road scene or the portrayal of Plankton's deterioration were handled handled in the way the writing team intended or would handle them again. It acknowledged the charged reception without committing to any position on whether that reception was warranted. It has remained the most direct public acknowledgement from any production participant that the episode's legacy is anything other than straightforward. The episode's place in the broader arc of how SpongeBob handled Plankton across its run adds one more layer to the specific discomfort it produces. Plankton is a recurring villain with a well-established set of motivations and a clearly delineated relationship to the rest of the cast, one built over hundreds of episodes into something that the audience understands and can predict. His schemes fail, his plans collapse, his ambitions go unrealized, and the show has always treated this pattern as comedic precisely because Plankton's resilience in the face of consistent defeat is part of what defines him. He keeps trying because he is built to keep trying, and the gap between his aspirations and his outcomes is where the comedy lives. One course meal breaks this pattern in the worst possible direction. The defeat Plankton experiences in this episode is not the defeat of his plans or his schemes. It is the defeat of his ability to function as a living thing with access to something resembling peace. That is a different category of loss than any previous episode had asked this character to absorb, and the show offered him nothing meaningful in return for absorbing it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. An episode depicting sustained psychological cruelty and its direct consequences aired without any intervention and remains in the catalog to this day without comment from anyone at the network responsible for it. Section 8. SpongeBob in Random Land. SpongeBob in Random Land aired on September 21st, 2019 as the first segment of the 16th episode of Season 12, and for its first few weeks in rotation, it contained something that a specific portion of its audience recognized immediately, and that a different portion of its audience found deeply unsettling without being able to explain why. The two reactions came from the same image, lasted the same fraction of a second, and produced completely different experiences depending entirely on whether the person watching it had spent time in a corner of the internet that most children had never visited. The scene was removed from American broadcasts starting on November 11th, 2019, replaced without announcement, and the image that had been there before was gone from the version of the episode that most viewers would encounter going forward. One of the people responsible for putting it there described the removal as, in his own words, actually kind of fun. The episode itself is built around a delivery gone wrong, the kind of premise the show had used effectively across multiple seasons to generate comedic conflict between SpongeBob and Squidward by forcing them into an unfamiliar situation together with no easy exit. Mr. Krabs assigns them to deliver a single Krabby Patty to a customer living in a place called Random Land, a location the show treats as a separate dimension operating entirely outside the laws of logic, physics, and visual consistency that govern the rest of Bikini Bottom. The episode was conceived as a tribute to a 1938 Looney Tunes short called Porky in Wacky Land, a landmark piece of animation directed by Bob Clampett that sent Porky Pig into a surreal landscape populated by creatures that defied any stable visual identity, changing shape and form and internal logic from frame to frame in ways that pushed the boundaries of what animation was understood to be capable of at the time. SpongeBob in Random Land aims for a similar effect, filling its version of the impossible landscape with characters and objects that exist purely to be strange, creatures with no consistent logic behind their design, environments that shift without explanation, and a general refusal to commit to any visual rule long enough for the audience to feel anchored. SpongeBob and Squidward navigate this landscape as a delivery mission that keeps getting derailed by the place itself, since Random Land does not cooperate with the ordinary mechanics of getting from one location to another. The episode uses this structure to generate a series of quick visual gags, most of them built around the gap between the pair's increasingly frustrated attempts to find their destination and the total indifference of the landscape to their goals. Squidward, who has never found any situation involving SpongeBob anything other than exhausting, responds to Random Land with the specific despair of someone who had already reached their limit before the journey started. SpongeBob, whose capacity for genuine alarm in strange situations is constantly undercut by his equally genuine capacity for delight in new experiences, moves through the same landscape with a different kind of disorientation. The specific sequence that generates generated everything that followed is built around a set of doors. SpongeBob and Squidward encounter a row of doors in Random Land and begin opening them to search for a path through, a visual structure that gives the episode permission to stack a series of unrelated jokes in quick succession, each door revealing something different and each revelation functioning as its own self-contained gag. The first door opens onto something absurd and harmless. The second door produces another quick visual joke. The third door is the one that changed the episode's history. Squidward opens it. The interior shows what appears to be Squidward's own bedroom. The camera holds for a fraction of a second on that interior, and then a version of Squidward appears in the frame. His eyes are red. Not cartoon red in the exaggerated comedic way the show uses to signal anger or surprise. Red and bloodshot and still, with something running down his face from them in dark lines, rendered in a way that sits outside the show's normal visual vocabulary. A loud, sharp sound accompanies the image. Squidward slams the door immediately. He and SpongeBob move on. The episode continues. The entire sequence lasts approximately 3 seconds. For viewers who had never encountered the specific piece of internet folklore the image was referencing, those 3 seconds registered as an unexplained horror beat dropped without context into the middle of a comedic episode. Disturbing in the way that something is disturbing when it does not fit the register of everything surrounding it and offers no explanation for why it is there. For viewers who had spent time in the corners of online fan culture where the source material for the image had circulated for nearly a decade, those 3 seconds registered as a direct and deliberate acknowledgement of something they had not expected the show itself to ever notice. The reference was to a piece of internet writing that had been circulating since approximately 2010, built around a fictional account of a disturbing and unauthorized version of SpongeBob that someone claimed to have witnessed in an editing suite. The story centered on an episode called Squidward's Suicide, and the image most commonly associated with it across years of circulation was a version of Squidward's face with precisely the kind of eyes the Random Land scene depicted. That image had traveled widely enough through internet culture that it had become a recognizable shorthand for the entire legend, reproduced and remixed across fan art, reaction images, and video recreations, to the point where the face itself carried the reference, even stripped of the written story behind it. The show's writers knew the legend. They put the face in the episode on purpose. Adam Paloyan, who served as a storyboard director on the episode and was directly responsible for the sequence containing the reference, explained how the decision came together in accounts shared after the episode aired. He needed a third visual gag to complete the door-opening sequence and had not settled on what it should be. The reference to the creepypasta came to him as a solution to that specific creative problem. A third joke that would land differently from the first two, and that would give a particular subset of the audience something the rest of the episode was not providing. He later acknowledged that he had not been entirely certain the reference would survive the approval process, noting that he had treated it as something of a risk when he included it in the board. It survived. The episode was produced with the scene intact and aired with it on September 21st, 2019. A specific piece of original music was composed for the 3-second sequence. The cue was given the title Red Mist Cue in the production materials, a direct naming of the secondary title under which the creepypasta had circulated across various online communities. The decision to name the cue specifically after the legend, rather than giving it a generic title, was a small but clear indicator of how consciously the production team was engaging with the reference they were making. They were not accidentally echoing something they had half remembered from somewhere. They were making a specific choice, composing a specific piece of music for it, and giving that piece of music a title that confirmed exactly what the choice was. Kaz, the episode's writer, and Paloyan both addressed the reference in public comments after the episode aired, describing their intention as making fun of the creepypasta in the spirit of something the episode's own surreal register gave them permission to do. The framing they offered was of a gentle, affectionate mockery, rather than a genuine attempt to frighten viewers, consistent with the episode's broader approach of treating randomness and strangeness as comedic rather than threatening. Random Land was already a place where the show's normal rules did not apply, which gave the writers a structural justification for inserting an image that would have been impossible to include in any standard Bikini Bottom setting. The landscape of the impossible is, logically enough, where the impossible face could appear. disappear. The generational divide in how the scene landed became visible almost immediately after the episode aired. Viewers who had grown up with the show and later discovered the creepypasta as older teens or adults watching retrospective content online recognized the reference immediately and responded with a specific kind of delight that comes from a piece of media acknowledging something you had not expected it to know about. Some of them shared the clip specifically to spread that recognition, tagging friends who would understand the reference and posting it in communities where the creepypasta had been discussed. The scene became evidence in their reading that the people making the show were paying attention to the culture built around it, which felt like an unusual and satisfying form of acknowledgement. Younger viewers encountering the episode without that context had no mechanism for reading the scene as a joke. A child watching SpongeBob in Randomland in September or October of 2019 who had never been exposed to the creepypasta did not see an inside reference to a decade-old piece of internet folklore. They saw a disturbing image appear without warning or explanation in the middle of a cartoon, accompanied by a sharp noise, and then disappear again, with no acknowledgement that anything unusual had just happened. The episode did not frame the image as funny for anyone who did not bring the frame with them from outside the episode, and for viewers who had not brought that frame, the experience of those 3 seconds was exactly what the creepypasta had always been designed to produce. Something was wrong, and there was no explanation for it. Vincent Waller, who served as co-executive producer on the show during this period, confirmed the removal decision and attributed it to what he described as a standards and practices issue, the formal designation for a content review that determines whether a piece of material meets a network's internal guidelines for broadcast. The specific nature of the standards and practices concern was not elaborated on in any public statement, but the combination of the reference's subject matter and the audience response it generated among viewers who did not understand the reference pointed clearly enough toward the reasoning. A scene referencing a piece of internet fiction built around deeply dark subject matter, landing without context or preparation on an audience of children whose parents had decided a Nickelodeon cartoon required no prior review, represented exactly the kind of situation standards and practices processes exist to prevent after the fact. The UK version of the episode had handled the sequence differently from the start. British airings cut the scene entirely rather than replacing it, jumping directly from the second door to Squidward's line about never getting out of Randomland, a cut that removed the gag but also created a minor continuity gap in the sequence's rhythm. American airings, by contrast, replaced the red mist scene rather than cutting it, substituting a version of Squidward as a baby soiling a diaper, a visual gag consistent with the episode's broader commitment to absurdity and carrying none of the reference weight of what it replaced. The substitution was seamless, in the sense that it preserved the 3-door structure and gave the sequence a third beat, but anyone who had seen the original broadcast and then watched a later airing was immediately aware that something different was in the slot where the other image had been. Poloyan's comment that the censorship was actually kind of fun communicated something specific about how the team responsible for the original decision related to its consequences. There was no defensiveness in the comment, no suggestion that the removal had been an injustice or an overcorrection. There was amusement, the kind of amusement that comes from having placed something in a specific slot and then watching the thing placed there generate exactly the kind of reaction that made sense given what it was. The comment sat alongside the confirmation that the production had known what they were doing when they made the choice, which meant the response was not entirely surprising to the people who had made it. The surprise, to the extent there was one, appears to have been in how widely the reaction spread beyond the community of viewers who were in on the reference. What SpongeBob in Randomland added to the show's complicated relationship with the darker corners of its own fan culture was a moment of direct acknowledgement that those corners existed and that the people inside the studio were not unaware of them. The show had built its history in part on the specific combination of cheerfulness and strangeness that made the early seasons feel genuinely unusual within the landscape of children's animation. And that combination had produced, over 2 decades of cultural circulation, a body of fan-generated content that pushed the strangeness into territory the show itself had never gone. The creepypasta creepypasta tradition that grew up around SpongeBob was a response to the show's own willingness to inhabit the unsettling edges of its world, an amplification of elements that were always present in the original material, taken to extremes that the original material never reached. Putting the face in the episode was a way of completing a circuit between the official show and the unofficial material it had inspired, and the removal of that face afterward closed the circuit again before it could carry more current than the network was prepared to handle. The baby Squidward who replaced it has no history behind him, no decade of internet circulation, no associations with anything darker than the straightforward comedy of an infant in a cartoon universe. He exists purely to fill the space left by something that turned out to be too specifically charged to stay where it had been placed. And he does the job without generating the kind of reaction that brings standards and practices into the conversation. The door opens and something absurd appears, and the episode moves on. Nobody is unsettled. Nobody recognizes anything. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 3 seconds, borrowed from internet mythology, replaced by a baby in a diaper with no public statement attached. Next comes an episode built entirely around content you were never supposed to find, years before that idea had a name. Section 9, The Sponge Who Could Fly. 7 years before the internet produced its first widely circulated lost episode story about SpongeBob, the show itself produced one, framed it as a genuine discovery of hidden material, released it on home video before it ever aired on television, and built its entire premise around the specific mythology of content that was never meant to be found. The episode that did all of this was the show's 100th installment, a milestone Nickelodeon treated as a genuine occasion worth marking. The way they chose to mark it was to tell their audience that the episode had been lost, that someone had found it under a desk, and that what was about to air was a piece of SpongeBob that had been sitting in a drawer somewhere at the studio, unknown and unseen, until this particular moment in March of 2003. None of that was true. All of it was the premise. The Sponge Who Could Fly carries a second official title across its various releases and broadcast listings. It is also called the SpongeBob SquarePants Lost Episode, and Nickelodeon used both designations across the promotional campaign that surrounded it, leaning heavily on the lost episode framing in advertising materials and broadcast announcements in the weeks leading up to its premiere. The word lost, in the context of children's television in 2003, did not carry the specific weight of dread that it would acquire over the following decade as internet culture developed its own tradition of fictional lost media horror. In 2003, a lost episode was simply something that had gone missing, a piece of content that existed but could not be found, and the concept's association with creepypasta and internet mythology was still years away from forming. Nickelodeon was borrowing the phrase for its promotional energy, not for any darker resonance it might eventually develop. The episode's structure is divided between 2 separate narratives that alternate throughout the runtime. The first follows Patchy the Pirate, a live-action character played by Tom Kenny, the same actor who voiced SpongeBob, who appeared in several SpongeBob specials as the president of SpongeBob's fan club. Patchy functioned across his various appearances as a version of the most devoted imaginable fan of the show, a collector and enthusiast whose relationship to SpongeBob ran so deep that his actual life had organized itself around it, and the comedy of his segments came from the gap between the magnitude of his dedication and the ordinary, slightly chaotic domestic reality in which that dedication played out. The Patchy segment that opens the episode begins with him in the shower, disrupted by his parrot companion Potty, who alerts him that there is an audience waiting to see the lost episode. Patchy delivers the first beat of the premise directly to the camera, telling viewers that he has lost the lost episode. The framing is immediate and specific. There is a lost episode. It was in Patchy's possession. He no longer has it. The segment proceeds from this disclosure into a musical montage titled Remembering SpongeBob, a clip package assembled from previous seasons that functions simultaneously as a celebration of the show's first 100 episodes and as a way of filling the time while Patchy sets off to find what he has misplaced. The treasure map arrives through his window, delivered by a passing neighbor, and Patchy follows its directions through a sequence that takes him across a series of locations before depositing him at what the map labels the 7 trials of Monkey Lagoon, a playground attraction that puts him through a gauntlet of physical challenges, each more ridiculous than the last. The trials serve as physical comedy in the tradition of the show's broader approach to slapstick, and they give the Patchy segment something to do while the premise builds toward the payoff that the entire structure is designed to deliver. He survives the trials, finds a treasure chest containing a VHS tape, and rushes back to his house to watch it with Potty. The tape begins. The audience watching at home is in the same position as Patchy, waiting for the lost episode to reveal itself, and the episode delivers something to both parties that is not what either of them came for. The television screen shows SpongeBob walking, just walking, a single repeating animation cycle of SpongeBob moving across the screen, set to upbeat music, continuing without variation for long enough that it becomes genuinely strange before it becomes genuinely funny. No plot, no dialogue, no development of any kind, just the cycle, the music, and the growing understanding that something is wrong with what is on the tape. The sequence ends abruptly, with the screen cutting to broadcast test bars and a flat tone. Patchy's response is the episode's fullest comedic set piece. He does not take this with equanimity. He spirals through something between rage and heartbreak, tearing apart his collection of SpongeBob merchandise and declaring that he will run away forever, that SpongeBob has betrayed him, that the whole thing was a lie. The destruction and flight happen in real time, giving Tom Kenny the opportunity to commit to a comedic breakdown that pushes further than the Patchy segments usually went, and the physical comedy of him methodically destroying a room full of objects he clearly treasures while screaming about betrayal has a specific quality that requires both the performance and the audience's understanding of how much Patchy was supposed to care about these things for the joke to land at the scale the episode needs it to. The correction arrives before Patchy gets too far from the house. A countdown appears on the television screen. The real lost episode is about to begin. Patchy runs back, replaces everything he has just destroyed by playing the footage in reverse, and sits down in time for the animated episode to start. The reversal sequence, simple as it is, encodes within itself the entire emotional architecture of the Patchy segment. He destroyed something precious in response to being disappointed, and then put it back together when the disappointment turned out to be temporary. The episode presented genuine loss, and then undid it, a structure that runs through the animated segment, waiting on the other side of this moment as well. The animated episode begins at Jellyfish Fields, with SpongeBob watching jellyfish move through the water above him and wishing he could fly with them. The desire is specific and earnest in the way SpongeBob's desires always are, and the episode takes it seriously, rather than treating it as a joke to be deflated. He constructs a series of flying machines with increasing ambition and decreasing success, each attempt reflecting a different approach to the problem, and each failure playing out with the show's characteristic combination of physical comedy and genuine investment in what SpongeBob is trying to do. The machines break, the attempts fail, and Bikini Bottom watches each one with the kind of public ridicule that the show's crowd characters frequently provided for SpongeBob's more ambitious projects. Farmer Jenkins, whose windmill SpongeBob destroys during one of the early attempts, becomes the voice of a community that has decided SpongeBob's dream is their problem, rather than his personal aspiration. A dynamic the episode develops with enough specificity to give it real comedic weight. The townspeople who ridicule SpongeBob for trying to fly are not wrong that his attempts have been causing damage. They are wrong in the way they go about expressing that objection, which is to manufacture a public identity for him called the Birdman of Bikini Bottom, and use it as a vehicle for collective mockery that runs well past any proportionate response to the property damage. SpongeBob, who had only wanted to share the experience of flight with the creatures he admires most, internalizes the mockery and gives up. The reversal of his fortune arrives through the episode's decision to give a slapstick disaster its own meaning. SpongeBob's balloon-assisted kite contraption is destroyed by a villager's cannonball during one of his attempts, and he falls to earth, losing his pants in the process, and lands in a truck of mud that then deposits him into a truck of feathers. The feathers coat him completely, and the jellyfish of Jellyfish Fields, responding to whatever internal logic governs their attraction to things they want to interact with, surround his feet and begin lifting him.
SpongeBob,
by accident and through the loss of something he thought he needed, achieves exactly what he had been trying to achieve all along. He flies. The episode celebrates this with an original song called He's Flying, built in the intentionally simple, slightly corny mode of a children's musical number that the show occasionally deployed when it wanted to land an emotional beat through sincerity rather than irony. The townspeople who had spent the episode mocking him are briefly moved by the sight of him actually flying, and then immediately redirect their energy toward recruiting him to use his new ability for their personal errands. The comedy of the final act comes from SpongeBob's inability to refuse any of the requests, which keep him occupied with tasks that have nothing to do with jellyfish or flight or any of the things that made the ability feel meaningful in the first place, until a cannonball from Farmer Jenkins separates him from his pants again and deposits him back on the ground. The townspeople, discovering that the flight was somehow connected to the pants and not to SpongeBob himself, deliver one of the episode's darker jokes by completely ignoring SpongeBob's physical well-being in favor of mourning the pants, which they treat as the actual loss while SpongeBob lies stunned nearby. The eulogy they give for the pants, delivered with genuine solemnity, is more heartfelt than anything they said to SpongeBob directly across the entire episode. The resolution brings SpongeBob back to Jellyfish Fields, where the jellyfish find him on the ground and lift him without the pants, revealing that the ability had never required the specific garment at all, and that his earlier understanding of what made it work had been wrong from the start. He flies with them, finally, doing the thing he had been trying to do since the opening scene, and the episode ends with a song that earns its warmth through the length of the journey that preceded it. Back in Patchy's segment, the tape containing the episode is accidentally destroyed by Patchy while he attempts to use a remote control, the tape unspooling and ruining itself before he fully understands what the remote is doing to it. The lost episode, recovered through a treasure hunt and watched once, becomes truly and permanently lost in the final minutes of its own broadcast. Patchy's reaction is subdued in a way that reads differently from his earlier breakdown, quieter and more resigned, and the episode ends with him sitting with the fact of the loss rather than against it. The structure completes itself. The lost episode was found, watched, and lost again, and the whole thing played out in under an hour on a Saturday afternoon on Nickelodeon. What the episode built into its own bones in March of 2003, without anyone involved in its production being able to know what they were doing at the cultural level, was a rehearsal of the specific emotional sequence that the internet's lost episode tradition would spend the following 2 decades refining. The premise of content that existed but could not be found, the search for it through materials that promised access, the anticipation of something rare and hidden, the disappointment of finding something wrong in the place where the real thing was supposed to be, the eventual arrival of something genuine that felt different because of everything that preceded it, and the final loss of even that genuine thing, which could not be held onto. All of these beats run through the Sponge Who Could Fly's structure in the same order that the creepypasta tradition would later use them, applied to horror rather than heartwarming comedy, but structurally identical in their sequencing. The fake tape of SpongeBob walk cycles is the most specific of these correspondences. The creepypasta tradition, when it wanted to build toward a disturbing reveal, would frequently establish a period of wrong normalcy first. Footage that was almost right but not quite. Something that looked like what the viewer expected, while also being clearly off in ways that built unease before the disturbing content arrived. The walk cycles in The Sponge Who Could Fly are doing the same thing in a comedic register, presenting something that has the shape of the expected content without being the expected content, holding that wrongness long enough for the audience to feel the gap before the correction arrives. The episode was not trying to frighten anyone, but the mechanism it was using to produce comedy from that gap between expectation and delivery was structurally identical to the mechanism the lost episode tradition would later use to produce dread from the same gap. The home video release that preceded the television premiere added another layer to the episode's relationship with the idea of content you were not supposed to find yet. The VHS and DVD release on March 4th, 2003 meant that anyone who purchased the tape before March 21st held in their hands an episode of SpongeBob that had not yet aired on television, a version of the show that existed commercially but had not yet been broadcast. The lost episode, sold before it could be seen on its official channel, was genuinely unavailable to anyone who did not go looking for it in a store. For the 2 weeks between the home video release and the television premiere, the SpongeBob SquarePants lost episode was was something you had to actively seek out, rather than something that arrived through ordinary viewing, giving the premise one real dimension underneath its promotional framing. The episode was eventually included in multiple home video compilations, and later became available on streaming platforms alongside the rest of the show's catalog. Patchy's final act of accidentally destroying the tape, played in the episode as a closing joke about the permanence of loss, became a small piece of irony once the episode itself was no longer at any risk of being lost. Available in better quality and more formats than a VHS tape found at the end of a treasure hunt through a playground. The lost episode survived every format transition that the tapes and discs of its era did not, and it continues to exist in the archive of a show that has never had any trouble being found by people who wanted to watch it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show rehearsed every beat of the lost episode premise in 2003 and played it as comedy. The recording that closes this video has been sitting in an archive since 1997 and has never needed a legend to make it hidden. Section 10. Procrastination. Procrastination ran in American broadcast rotation for roughly 4 years before a portion of it quietly disappeared from U.S. airings without a word of explanation from anyone at the network responsible for removing it. The episode had accumulated a strong critical reputation across that time, regarded by fans and reviewers who tracked the show closely as one of the sharper installments of its second season, and nothing in its 4-year broadcast history had generated any visible complaint or public concern about its content. Then, sometime around May of 2005, the version airing on Nickelodeon in the United States started running shorter than it had before. A scene that had been part of the episode since its original broadcast on October 19th, 2001, was gone. The transition in its place slightly abrupt, and the network offered no acknowledgement that anything had changed. The reasons behind the cut have never been officially confirmed by anyone at Nickelodeon, and the specific scene that was removed spent years circulating in fan communities as one of the show's more quietly documented pieces of hidden content, before its eventual restoration to streaming made the whole situation feel almost like it had never happened. The episode itself is built around a premise that sat slightly outside the show's usual structure during this period. Rather than placing SpongeBob and another character in an external situation that generates conflict or adventure, procrastination confines SpongeBob almost entirely to his own house for the duration of the episode, and asks what happens when the most motivated, most enthusiastic, most relentlessly productive character in Bikini Bottom is faced with a task he cannot bring himself to complete. Mrs. Puff assigns her boating school class an essay of no fewer than 800 words on the subject of what not to do at a stoplight due the following day, and SpongeBob arrives home that afternoon in a state of total readiness to begin. He has his pencil, he has his paper, he has his full attention committed to the task. He writes the title, stares at the blank space beneath it, and then spends the rest of the episode doing everything except writing the essay. The comedy of the episode comes from the specific texture of SpongeBob's procrastination, rather than from any external interference. There are no villains, no schemes, no crises that arrive from outside to derail the work. The obstacles are entirely internal and mundane. SpongeBob spends time deciding which pencil to use. He notices eraser shavings on his paper and cannot write until they are removed. He becomes aware of a choice between bread types while making a sandwich and cannot resolve it quickly. He calls Patrick to check on something minor and ends up in a pointless circular conversation. He cleans the kitchen. He exercises. Each distraction is presented with the same visual seriousness that the episode gives to everything else, so that the absurdity of choosing between white and rye bread becoming an existential delay carries genuine comedic weight rather than being dismissed as too trivial to earn screen time. The episode deepens as it progresses, pushing the premise past straightforward procrastination comedy into something more formally surreal. The world around SpongeBob begins responding to his unfinished essay in ways that suggest his guilt has started shaping reality. A newscast reports on the situation. His possessions come alive and conspire against him. A flame from a candle reads the incomplete essay and decides to punish him for it by burning down his house, which screams at him to stop wasting time as it does so. The nightmare logic of the final act accumulates until SpongeBob wakes up at his desk to discover that almost none of what he experienced actually happened, that only 5 minutes have passed since he last looked at the clock, and that he now has exactly 5 minutes left to write the essay before morning. The deleted scene sits in the early portion of the episode, between the moment when SpongeBob acknowledges that the assignment is harder than he initially assumed, and the moment when he commits to exercising as a distraction. In the original version that aired from 2001 through sometime in 2005, SpongeBob approaches his window and looks outside, where he sees his friends gathered in what appears to be a carnival atmosphere in the space between his house and Squidward's. Patrick is there, and Sandy is there, and the scene depicts Patrick applying suntan lotion to Sandy's shoulders while facing SpongeBob's window. Sandy is wearing her standard swimsuit rather than her full environmental suit, which she does not require outside her tree dome, given that the underwater environment of Bikini Bottom does not present the air supply problem she faces in her dome. SpongeBob watches from the window and responds with a visible physical reaction, his nose moving in a way that the scene holds long enough for the movement to register before the episode cuts away. The scene continues with SpongeBob deciding to exercise in response to watching his friends enjoy themselves outdoors, and at some point during the exercise sequence, he falls forward onto his desk in exhaustion, landing in the specific slumped position that the episode returns to later when he wakes up from his nightmare. That continuity detail is important because the cut version of the episode removes the falling asleep moment, along with the beach scene, leaving SpongeBob simply present at his desk at the start of the nightmare sequence, without any preceding shot that established how he came to be there in that position. The transition is not broken enough to be confusing to a casual viewer, but it is notably less smooth than the original, and anyone who had seen the uncut version and then watched the edited one had an immediate visual marker confirming that something had been removed. The theories that have circulated about why Nickelodeon chose to cut the scene are several, and none has ever been confirmed as the actual reason. The first, and most widely discussed, focuses on the specific visual of Patrick applying suntan lotion to Sandy's shoulders. The framing of the shot, with Patrick's hands on Sandy's back while facing the camera and SpongeBob watching from above, was read by some viewers, and likely by whoever made the decision to remove the scene, as suggesting something other than straightforward sunscreen application. The argument is not that the scene is explicitly sexual, but that the combination of the framing and SpongeBob's subsequent physical reaction created an implication that made the sequence difficult to defend as unambiguously innocent content for the age group watching the show. The second theory centers on SpongeBob's nose movement, which has been described in detailed fan accounts of the scene as flexing or extending in a way that reads as a visual euphemism of the kind that adult animation used regularly, but that sat unusually in a program aimed at children. This reading requires the viewer to be paying attention to the specific animation of SpongeBob's face during the window scene, and to interpret it in a particular way, which means it would have landed differently depending on the age and viewing context of the person watching. For a child viewer, it was simply SpongeBob making a face. For an adult viewer or a content reviewer analyzing the sequence carefully, it presented a different problem. The third theory is the one that sources connected to the production have occasionally pointed toward, though without anything that constitutes an official statement. This account attributes the cut to a concern about the car crash sequence embedded within the deleted portion, a brief animated moment depicting a vehicle accident that some within the network reportedly feared might be imitated by children watching the episode. This explanation has been treated skeptically by most fans who have analyzed the situation, for reasons that hold up under examination. The car crash is a small visual gag within a larger sequence, not the central image of the scene, and removing the entire sequence, including the beach scene and the falling asleep moment, to address concern about a brief background animation would be an unusually disproportionate editorial response. The cut does not preserve any part of the sequence while removing the problematic element. It removes everything. What is documented without significant dispute is that the cut was implemented around May of 2005, several years after the episode first aired, which itself raises questions that the other explanations do not fully address. If the beach scene and its surrounding content were problematic enough to remove, they were problematic at the time the episode first aired in October of 2001. The 4-year gap between the original broadcast and the removal does not correspond cleanly with any specific external event in 2005 that would have prompted a review of older content, and no account of the decision has provided a reason for why this particular moment, rather than any other, was when someone decided the sequence needed to come out. The international situation around the cut reflects the same uneven pattern that showed up with the Just One Bite gas scene years earlier. The UK version of the episode retained the deleted sequence throughout the period when US airings were running the edited version, and some other international broadcasts continued to air the complete episode as well. Fan communities tracking censorship differences across regional broadcasts of the show confirmed that the cut was not applied globally, and that viewers in certain territories could watch the full episode, including the beach scene, through standard broadcast means during the years when American audiences were receiving the shortened version. The color quality of the US edited version became its own minor documentation issue within fan communities studying the episode. When Nickelodeon implemented the cut and began airing the shortened version, reports from viewers and screenshotted comparisons posted in fan forums suggested that the colors in the edited version were noticeably different from those in the original broadcast, appearing washed out or less vibrant in a way that made the edit visibly detectable, not just through the missing content, but through a change in the visual quality of what remained. Whether this represented a deliberate change to the master or an artifact of how the editing was implemented is not something that has been explained officially, but it gave viewers a second marker beyond the content gap itself through which the altered version could be identified. The scene eventually resurfaced through the same routes that brought other cut SpongeBob content back into public view, circulating through fan communities that tracked the show's censorship history and through early video hosting platforms where original broadcast recordings were uploaded and shared. When it became more widely visible in clear enough quality for viewers who had only ever seen the US edited version to examine it closely, the discussion that followed was notably lower key than the reactions that had accompanied other discovered cuts from the show's history. The scene was not shocking. It was not alarming. The theories about why it had been removed made more sense when viewed abstractly than when sitting with the actual footage, which read as a beach scene with a mildly suggestive visual component that was not obviously more problematic than material the show had put on screen in other episodes during the same period without any intervention. The restoration came in stages. Reports from viewers tracking the show's streaming and broadcast situation indicated that the uncut version of the episode began airing on Nicktoons in the United States in October of 2019, with the remastered version of the episode including the previously deleted sequence. The availability on Paramount Plus followed by 2021, establishing the complete episode as the version accessible through the network's primary streaming platform after approximately 14 years of US viewers encountering only the shortened cut. No announcement accompanied the restoration. The scene was simply there again, in the same quiet way that it had disappeared. Procrastination is remembered as one of the better episodes from Season 2, and honestly, that reputation is well earned. The writing holds up, the surreal nightmare logic still lands, and the basic experience of sitting down to do something important and finding every possible reason not to is so universal that the episode connects with viewers who have never given a second thought to SpongeBob's world outside of it. The deleted scene is a small footnote in all of that, a brief stretch of animation that was quietly removed, quietly restored 14 years later, and never explained either time. Most people watching the full episode on Paramount Plus today have no idea the scene was ever missing. It just sits there now, back in its original place, as if nothing happened. The network took it out without saying why, and put it back without saying why, and the episode kept being good through all of it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.